Welcome and thank you for being here, and thanks to Karma for having us this afternoon. I think it's such a great way to spend a rainy, cloudy, grey day in LA in the company of the artist Ouattara Watts and yourselves. And I'd like to welcome my fellow panelists, Tiffany and Ike, both of whom will introduce themselves. And just to say that I'm Natasha Becker, and I'm the curator for the Arts of Africa at the De Young Museum in San Francisco. And Tiffany, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. I'm Tiffany Barber. I am a professor of African American art at UCLA. I also am a curator and a writer and a dancer. There's lots of things that I do, but yeah, it's nice to be here.
I'm Ike. I'm a curatorial assistant at the Hammer. I also write and, do a whole lot. But yeah, happy to be here. Happy to talk about this.
Thank you for being here.
Yeah.
So, when we were thinking about this conversation, we were sharing just our first encounters and our first impressions with the artist Ouattara Watts. And perhaps before we each of us share that, I'd just like to say a few words about the artist for those who may not be familiar with Ouattara Watts. He was born in 1957 in the Ivory Coast, Côte d'Ivoire, and he was, since he was a child, interested in art and spirituality and the world around him. He was drawing and painting from a very young age. He grew up in a household where his father was a doctor and also a spiritual healer, and so that intersection between science and spirituality was something that was present. He grew up in a context where religion was syncretic, so there were Islamic influences, Christian influences, Judaism, as well as African spirituality, West African spirituality. And when he was around 19 years old, he went to Paris to study painting, and this was because he had already started looking at books, at the local cultural center, where he discovered artists like Picasso and Modigliani, and he was very much drawn to them. And I think it's so interesting that he was, because in fact those artists were looking at Africa and at African art within their own work. And so it's interesting that they were looking at Africa, and he was looking at them from Africa. And so he goes to France, to Paris, where he studied painting, and he was part of other students from the Ivory Coast who were in Paris to study art. And this was in the 70s, and he studied with quite an, it seems like Jacques Yankel, the French painter, but with, I think, a very strong Jewish heritage, and who also had traveled in Africa and was actually quite really interesting himself. And Ouattara started showing his work in a professional way by about the mid-1980s, and he showed in France. He showed his paintings in France, and he mentions quite often that what he was always trying to pursue or express was, his what he learned in West Africa growing up, what he learned during his life in Europe, and how to bring all these disparate influences in his life together, and to understand them through his art. And in the late 80s, actually the last year of Jean-Michel Basquiat's life, they met in Paris, and that very short time period, because it was 1988, and I think he died in August of 1988, that convinced him to come to New York, actually, you know, and I believe they also, I read somewhere that they did a trip to New Orleans together, where they looked at, you know, voodoo practices and just the transmission of African culture within New Orleans. So I think that was, you know, they were about 3 years or so apart in age, so I could see how Basquiat looked at him and maybe saw, you know, this kind of kindred spirit in the ways in which they were articulating themselves within the art practice, and also how he found, you know, someone that he could relate to, because his work is also so distinctive, and of course the work is so different because Basquiat, we see representational elements, you know, we see heads and we see athletes, or we see, you know, the artist himself, whereas in much of Ouattara's work, there are some pieces where he's done a homage to, you know, Miles Davis, for instance, a musician, but for the most part, on the whole, has this much more non-representational practice. And so he does come to New York City in the late 80s, and that is where he still lives today. And that was obviously a very interesting and intense time, because the neo-expressionist movement that had started in like the 60s, 70s, and 80s was kind of at its peak, but also perhaps, you know, had already peaked. And so I think he was part of this very interesting milieu where, you know, where as an African artist coming via, you know, West Africa, Europe, and now being in New York City, was also, you know, in conversation and trying to find his place in this very, you know, white male dominated environment. And today, looking at this work, I think there's more in common here with like Hilma af Klint, you know, than with those painters. But of course, we do see that there is this really strong, you know, use of color and form, and in his work, and symbols and all those things we'll talk about as well. So, you know, his studio's in Bushwick, and my first encounter with him was through a studio visit last year, but I had been familiar and I'd been following his work. He had his first solo show with Karma Gallery in New York City last year, and this is his second solo, but his first exhibition with the gallery in Los Angeles. He has shown in Europe as well, and in Africa too, in South Africa, for instance, and other places. And when you go to Bushwick, it's very industrial, lots of warehouses, and you step into his studio and it's quite magical, because there's African fabrics, you know, that part of the walls draped in fabric, there's music playing, jazz or you know, Afro beats, there's canvases that are spread out in various, you know, states of development, and he's, you know, working on them sometimes, you know, at the same time. Sometimes he'll focus on one and move to another. He also works on the floor as well. So it's quite a magical environment, the studio, and he has little photographs stuck up and little, you know, drawings and all kinds of sources that really you feel that you have stepped into another world. And so it's a very enclosed space. It's a really, you know, moving space to be in, and you enter it and without knowing, you know, behave in a very respectful way, because he's a very introspective person, and you know, somebody who really chooses his words carefully, and a very quiet, shy, philosophical kind of person. And so, you know, just entering into that space that he creates, you already feel like you are in the presence of, you know, a very special encounter. And although he doesn't say much, you know, because he has this ponderous way of speaking where, you know, he's thinking, and, you know, the outcome of what he says is the outcome of that process. But it was a really interesting experience to step out into the gritty streets of Bushwick and then into, you know, his studio and to be transported to this, you know, these worlds that he creates. And with that, you know, I'm going to hand over to Tiffany and to Ike to ask them to share some of their impressions and first introductions to Ouattara's work, and share some of the things that struck you about, you know, the artist and his work.
Go first. I think when we were chatting yesterday, I think you'd mentioned that he doesn't allow photography in his studio. And you know, thinking about the thematics within the show, or what he talks about in the show, I think that painting there is called Secret House, or Secret House. And then this through line of the Sigui, which is like a Dogon ceremonial practice where young boys would seclude themselves for several months and then kind of reappear, but part of that kind of like ritual comes out of this idea or belief that I think 3,000 years ago, the Dogon were met by these amphibious creatures. So I think thinking about the blues throughout the show kind of really segues with that myth. But you know, I think, you know, thinking about the no photography, and also the way in terms of what we spoke about, like he doesn't really like too much nitty-gritty interpretations of the symbols in his work. You know, it's there as something to sit with and decode if you want, but also there's a lot of rich, formal, abstract registers. There's a lot of mathematical equations. You can see pi throughout some of the work, numbers, which kind of alludes back to what Natasha said about, you know, the science, spirituality aspect. But I think with the through line of the spirituality aspect for me, especially with this Sigui process, you know, and this secret house got me thinking about, you know, the idea of diaspora within his work, and especially from my position, being Igbo, being Nigerian, we also have similar practices around, you know, sequestering oneself to create. So the Mbari houses that come out of the Igbo is something that kind of like cuts across, and I think knowing Ouattara was very much into different African spiritual practices, I imagine he was quite aware of these other, you know, spiritual threads. So I think for me, thinking about the no photography, this seclusion that happens, be it 1 or 2 months, with the Mbari houses, it would be like a group of artists that would sequester themselves for a year or 2 and then reveal the work. I think it's interesting to think about the creating or the making of this work as a type of, you know, a nod to that, you know, thinking about the artist in the studio, not allowing photography, kind of keeping things sequestered inside, and then seeing what emerges. And, you know, I think, you know, thinking about the secretive languages that these young men would speak when they would get secluded, you know, goes back to, you know, what is in the paintings and, you know, how we try and make sense of them, you know. He's not giving us like a roadmap. I think we have to just sit with them and kind of like try and unpack them in a way.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think my first impressions of the work were very formal. And walking through to the galleries today, also thinking about, which is something that we didn't talk about yesterday when we had our little kind of initial chat about what we would talk about today, is texture.
Yes.
So I was thinking, I mean, my first impressions are like, okay, color, and there are references to transporting. You talked a little bit about these kinds of worlds that he builds, and these kinds of portals that we enter into as viewers, and how there's like different signposts to guide us, to transport us, but also like actual material references, like the shoe prints on this painting, for instance. And so I I was thinking about transportation, translation, this kind of like movement that happens in the work formally through color. And then also thinking about this show in the context of Los Angeles. Obviously there's a big art fair going on right now, which is why a lot of you are here. But it's interesting to think about this presentation of an African-born artist in Los Angeles at this moment, where there are several shows up that are also featuring African-born artists. And so kind of like thinking about why the continent is so important to Los Angeles right now. And then the colors that are in the paintings themselves also kind of like not being New York colors. You know, Ouattara's based in New York right now, but these colors that we see around us are not, I mean, when I go to New York, I don't see this kind of vibrancy. But so the kind of like, the way that this show also speaks to Los Angeles and draws out some of Los Angeles's own elements in terms of color and landscape and form, environment, atmosphere, and those things are also very much conceptual in the work as well.
I liked what you said about the presence of the continent, you know, in LA, and the presence of the continent both in the paintings, the presence of Africa, and that is almost transcontinental, trans-historical, but like the source of all things in some way, you know. And I feel that through his art journey and his art life, and also through the practice that he has been so committed to, because if you think about the influences and the milieus that he was part of, you know, and like how challenging it is to stay true to your own artistic, you know, impulses and voice and language, and you know, he's in his late 60s now and has been so committed to his practice, and you see that over the arc of his life so far. And within that, I feel that Africa is this primordial soup, you know, within which everything is you know, everything else is almost sort of swimming within that. And so his work for me are like these pools, you know, within which we see how, whether it's mathematics or science or astronomy or culture or popular culture or jazz music or, you know, color or, you know, visual art, that you know, you feel the presence of Africa. And, you know, I was just recently thinking about astronomy and cosmology, and, you know, reading some articles around African cosmologies. And the first, you know, before Stonehenge, like almost a millennia before Stonehenge, there were already circular stones in Egypt that, you know, mark the sunrise and the sunset, you know. And I feel that he's so connected to this sort of these deep histories of intersections before things became separated out into these categories and disciplines that, in fact, before they were all kind of connected in some way and served some other, you know, purpose. Science wasn't science for the sake of science in and of itself, or art for art in and of itself, but you know, really served this greater kind of worldviews that you was, you know, touching on. That was, you know, in African cosmologies there are a few common, you know, characteristics that, you know, there's God, there's the ancestors, there's the spirits, there's humans, there's animals, there's plants, there's, you know, the earth, and that is all connected, you know, the divine, the spiritual, it's heaven and it's earth. And so I feel that, you know, a practice spanning all these decades, why perhaps now and why his work is so important is just really shows this, I guess, in a sense, this, you know, really trans-historical diaspora and these ideas that have, you know, these like long histories, but that are still present today.
And I think what you're saying goes back to, you know, what Tiffany was sharing about the textures and you know, if you look at this work here, you can see kind of like the boot stains, you know, the movement of him kind of like stepping on the canvas. And as Natasha said, he works both up on the wall and on the floor. And I think what's interesting about, like, you know, the cosmology that you brought up is it's very much tethered to a philosophy of the body, in a way, thinking about, so, you know, I think bringing Tiffany's point and then this point together, like, the show up now at the Hammer Museum by Vamba Beliti, you know, we talked a lot about Ouattara and, you know, about the Vuhu Vuhu art movement that comes out of Ivory Coast that Ouattara was kind of a part of, in a way, tangentially, in the sense, if you think about, you know, when he dropped out of school when he was 16, he was reading at the French Cultural Center in Abidjan, which was kind of like the hot area where a few Martinican painters had set up this Black Caribbean school. And those teachers were kind of integral to kind of giving life to this Vuhu Vuhu movement. And Vuhu Vuhu is this guru term that translates into like dirt, garbage, or whatnot. But I think it's less so movement and more like a spiritual practice. And a part of that spiritual practice is thinking about the philosophy of the body in relation to the surrounding environment. And you know, if you think about what is guiding this show, you know, the cosmology aspect, this festival that these boys would partake in would happen when, you know, a certain moon or star would be between. So, and similar in Nigeria, and the Bari houses would begin if there was like a natural disaster. The community would then, you know, pay homage to the goddess Allah. So I think, you know, thinking about, you know, how, you know, even though he had this encounter with Basquiat, and people have talked about how like Basquiat has almost been so central to his story, but I think the fact that he's been able to continue to kind of like create these works is kind of tied to the fact that the body is still much central, he's tied to his spiritual practice. So I think
the materiality.
Yeah.
I was just
you know,
about to say,
you
yeah.
raised that, and you know what you sort of reinforced is that this materiality that is also present in the work, both in how he's painting with his body, because music is also an important part of that. You know, he loves music, and there's music playing in the studio when he's creating as well. But then you see the found materials also. Sometimes the canvases have found fabrics also within the canvas, so it's not all necessarily, you know, linen or canvas, but sometimes he'll weave in these found textiles into the work as well. And there is this walking over, you know, and these gestures that are very, you know, the splattering, the, you know, the bold movements within the dollops of, you know, different colors. So there is something very material. It's like assembling almost all these little bits of material culture, you know, within the work itself.
I was going to say about materiality, something that I was also thinking about in terms of texture is surface. And the surface of the, as you were talking about, surface of the canvas, but especially in this work, and there's the work on the other side of this wall as well, where there's something about the overlay of the canvas that shows itself in a particular type of way that I'm really interested in his work, that it's not like, even though he's bringing all of these references together and all of these symbols together, it's a soup that doesn't, one element doesn't outweigh or overtake the other, right? Like they're kind of like floating in their own and holding their own in the space. And so there's not a kind of, I think typically we think of this kind of like, oh, bringing things together, or an amalgam that results in an amalgamation or some kind of synthesis, and that doesn't really happen in these works. And part of what I see happening, or the gesture of like literally showing the seams of the canvas, is also kind of that too, and the mark of the artist, the labor that he's performing, walking over the canvas. There's not a preciousness about it, but it is really beautiful to look at. It is aesthetically pleasing, so I love that tension. And then the other thing I was thinking about, which I wasn't thinking about yesterday, but now that we've been talking about translation numerology, music. I'm like, oh, I'm starting to think of these as forms of notation. And I don't know, I'm like, I don't know where to go with that, but I'm just like, oh wow, like, I love thinking of this as his practice as a form of notation and as a method of knowledge production, like notation as a method of knowledge production. Yeah. That's what I've been thinking about.
Yeah,
while we've been talking.
Absolutely. There's that connection with music for sure, and also that the notations are also, the references are to knowledge systems that, you know, we may or may not be familiar with, but you also have to really trust the artists and the culture that produce those knowledge systems to hear the music, you know? And so I think that I like that you highlighted that aspect of his practice, because there is a movement, there is a body, there is you know, music, there is this performative quality also to how he works and to the works themselves, and then that relationship to writing, to knowledge, to...
And we were talking a little bit yesterday, and you mentioned it in your opening remarks, and I would love to hear you also kind of reflect on this a little bit more, is that the kind of neo-expressionist movement, the relationship to potentially a form of abstract expressionism that is not obviously European-centered, but like thinking of him working on the floor, obviously the reference to like Jackson Pollock comes to mind in terms of art history, like maybe that's the most salient reference, but what he's doing is slightly different. But I love thinking about him within this kind of lineage and how he is bringing a totally different kind of dimension to that history that often gets left out of historical accounts.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned also, you know, you touched on like the fact that people, and even Ouattara himself, I mean, his meeting with Basquiat was very important to him. He, you know, moved from one continent to another. That meeting energized him so, but I think that was because here were two black guys who were artists and doing this, you know, crazy, weird paintings that nobody maybe really understood. Of course, they would kind of connect in some way, you know.
And I think it's
was
important.
Much smaller then.
Very much smaller. And I also, so like they're all like kind of like, you know, connected in this way. But I also think that the blackness piece is like is very important because it's not initially an American blackness, right? Like Ouattara is from the continent. Basquiat obviously has Puerto Rican and Haitian lineage, so I think that's also think an important piece of that.
Absolutely, and so they connect, but. By then, I think Ouattara has already found his visual language. You know, he's already the painter he's going to be for the next few decades. So it's not a meeting where, you know, he's meeting a hero or somebody he's admired or, you know, that is somebody he's enthralled to in that sense. They are almost like peers, you know, they a few years difference between them. And so I feel that I could see how they could connect for all these reasons. But then coming to New York at that time as, you know, these young 20-something artist who speaks French, you know, and lived in both, as you say, Africa and in Europe, and is now in New York City. And, you know, what that must have been like was, you know, it was a very exciting time. There was a lot happening, but I do think that that you know, while the attention was on Basquiat, and you know, I mean, he was a prolific artist for the time that he was here, and you know, there was a huge light that was being shone on Basquiat, and you know, there are other artists that have come from the continent to New York, for instance, right? And that some of them we know about, some of them passed in obscurity, etc. But I think Ouattara, you know, I think he has the sensitivity, and having been among artists in the Ivory Coast, among artists in Paris, being among artists in New York City, he probably felt quite at home being among artists and observing all these different movements and all these different things that were happening. But at that time, I mean, his works are so different to what abstract expressionists were doing, only because he's bringing into his visual language the language of, you know, science, the language of spirituality, the language of, you know, I mean, where they overlap is color and the gesture and the bodily movement and this, you know, performative aspect to it. I think there are those overlaps, but I think his work was so unique and singular, and also so spiritual that spirituality is in contrast with that kind of, you know, hyper masculinity of the abstract expressionist movement. And, you know, I mentioned earlier that I think he has more in common with, you know, a painter like the Swedish painter Hilma af Klint, who was a spiritual mysticist as well, and was interested in the greater meaning of, you know, who we are and our place in the universe, and, you know, but more overtly so. I think Ouattara is much more materially grounded too, and grounded in a kind of social, cultural histories, perhaps. But, you know, one can see how that period of the 70s would have been a bit inhospitable to a black artist from the continent, and from, you know, having this diasporic experience as well. And so how would this work have been legible or readable, or, you know, what would the entry points have been besides the formal qualities of the work, you know, because this means having to engage with Africa, you know, and with Africa's presence in modern art, you know, with Africa's presence in the contemporary, you know, and I think that is still something that, you know, we contend with today, right?
Yeah. I think, like, you know, in looking at the work and thinking about what you just both said, you know, there's, you know, abstract forms have always been in, I think, the visual lexicon of African cultures. You know, I think even like in looking at this show, there's symbols that I remember from childhood, or just seeing drawings, or these uli houses that you'd see in and around like southeast Nigeria. Even there's a painting over there, there's two concentric circles, and that's like a uli form that you would see. So, you know, I think the limitations of, you know, abstract expressionism that was being written about in the 60s, 70s, whatnot, was that, you know, it was coming from a very like European American lens. And I think if you look at like African art history, look at the forms in it, it's always been there. I think the question is, you know, this lovely paper by Sylvester Ogbechi, who writes about like, because of like the history of Africa, you know, there's this material obsolescence around these abstract forms and these discursive forms, or how we talk about, you know, abstraction coming out of African art history, because of, you know, just the paucity of like engagement or interaction with it, you know. And I think that was part and parcel why you have people not understanding what he was doing in the 60s and 70s, you know, or, you know, when he got to New York. So I think if you're looking at forms of African art, you can see that, you know, before abstract expressionism was rocking, we were rocking with it, like well before. Pointillism. You know,
no, absolutely.
Before that, there was elements of that in Africa. You know, so.
No, I was thinking about histories of surrealism too. I'm working on this new project that's about the Black presence in surrealism broadly, but is really trying to kind of rewrite the art historical accounts of surrealism from a Black diasporic lens from the continent, and just even like thinking about Ouattara's positionality of, like you said, like studying these books and looking at Europe but looking at Europe, looking at Africa, so that exchange is really fascinating to me, and thinking about Ouattara's practice as a way to as an entry point into this project about the Black presence in surrealism. And of course, Faith Ringgold also talks about like African art is the origins of surrealism. Like you wouldn't have abstraction without African art. So, and yet art history is still very resistant to like adopting that narrative. And so I think Ouattara's paintings, also like these floating forms and all of these references, really put pressure on art history and the canon and museum practice even, and collecting and all of these kinds of things that we are thinking about in the 21st century in terms of like, oh, repatriation and decolonize, like all these kind of buzzwords, but he's been engaged in that project from the beginning.
Well, it definitely decenters a lot of those narratives to centralize African abstraction, African philosophy, cosmology, spirituality. You know, it sort of reorients it towards, you know, there was this small show at the Met called The African Roots of Civilization. It was a very small show that brought together works from, you know, Egypt and various parts of Africa, and you know, within this framework that the roots of civilization are, in fact, like many philosophers and historians and others have said, in Africa. Whatever criteria you use, maybe it's where was the first man, or maybe your criteria is about who had the biggest cities and the best urban centers first, or where were the centers of learning and knowledge, like whatever your criteria is, you know, that was in Africa. And the show is, you know, in a room that's smaller than the room that we are in. And I thought, oh, civilization. I mean, you know, so a really, really large word to use for, you know, a really small group of works. And the artworks were exquisite and the pairings were amazing, and it was wonderful to see them in that space. But, you know, to posit that means to, you know, fill an enormous space with African civilization that includes, you know, the sciences and learning and knowledge systems, but also city and urban, you know, structures and architecture, and, you know, I mean, just all these incredible developments, right? And that might be known if you know, historian of Africa, or you're interested in, you know, African literatures, or whatever your entry point is into Africa. But, you know, when we think about what is the story of civilization, we think, oh, it's, you know, the Roman Empire, or, right, like it's the Greeks and the Romans. That's really because those are the stories that have defined those narratives, and that, you know, orient those origins in the West and not in Africa, in fact. So, you know, I think that it does speak to the colonial project. It does speak to, you know, Western imperialism, both epistemological imperialism, but also, you know, the fact of imperial violence as well on the continent. And despite all of that, you know, the very survival of you know, the thriving of ideas and of people and of, you know, remaking culture and making culture over and over because of this, you know, rich wellspring within lies abstract thought, lies the capacity to imagine, lies, you know, the skills and the experiences and the histories and the journeys that people have taken. So for me, I'm so, you know, I feel always enlivened by being in Ouattara's world and in his presence, because it feels to me like I'm swimming in that, you know, sea of images and symbols and signs and times, and that they break through this time barrier that we sometimes have with African history. You know, it breaks the time barrier and puts it in the present. And of course, I'm deeply interested in history, and I'm a historian of Africa and African art and culture. So I'm, you know, in this, but my interest in that is what are the affordances that are there for the present, you know, and how does it afford like this breaking through these time barriers, and when they do, what do they bring, you know, what do they offer, what do they present, how do they present. So I'm very excited that the work is here in LA and that it's out there in the world for people to experience. And when I was in the gallery last week and looking at the show, it was also interesting to observe visitors, in the space with the work. And, there were two women who were just, they'd walk around and they'd come back to the same work, and then they'd walk around and they'd go back to and they just, couldn't decide which, but they were just so drawn, and you could see that they were really just mesmerized and held in this, in this, like the paintings were definitely vibing, and they were feeling that vibe,
Yeah, I want to build on something you just said about like the time and like how it breaks through, thinking about the different histories, Roman, African, whatnot. And I think it goes back to the material even, because, when Tiffany and I were in here a minute ago, we were asking about the textures, and then we were looking at some of the works and wondering, is it dirt? But it's not dirt. If you look closely, it seems like it's almost like a paper mache accumulation of paint that is made to mimic dirt. And it's interesting because, so the show that's up at the Hammer now, Vulnerability, I think a lot of people think about his work as this kind of like found object, using earthy materials and whatnot. But I think about like what you said about New York, like when you live in New York, where can you just go to just grab dirt? You can't just like pick it up from somewhere. So I think in a way when I look at the canvases and I was like, oh, that's actually not dirt. So I'm thinking he's like, kind of like figuring out new ways to create things that may feel familiar to him with what he's got. And I think Vamba is also in the same way, like, what may look like something is not actually what it is, and you just have to like look at it a bit longer to realize, oh, there's something at play here. It's not like a found object. It's just, maybe it's a gift or something, or something you've made in the studio to mimic something. So I think it's paying attention to the canvas will reveal some of these kind of like idiosyncrasies that cut across time.
Yeah.
Even these forms, these like oval forms, I think there's a painting outside where the oval form is continuing, and then at the bottom there's like this dark matter. It almost feels like what are those things? The time?
Yeah.
Yeah, the salt, whatever, you know what I mean.
What is that?
What do they call it?
Yeah.
The sands of time.
What's the object?
Hourglass.
Yeah. Hourglass.
Hourglass, yes.
I was like, the object, it's late.
Yes, hourglass, but
The end of the week.
It's there, yeah.
Yes. But I also noticed there are these like flowers, these these flourishing flowers, especially in this orange one and reds and the blue one there, and and they're right at the center of the canvas. That there's this this growth and this blossoming, within the center that that I was noticing today again, because I noticed different things when I was here last week, but that some of the canvases have the center, that pull you in, and then some feel like the secret house. It feels like it's flying, like it's a magic carpet ride, and that so it does feel like it traverses this like moments that are quiet and that can pull you into its center, but then these really expansive, more magical, more cosmic experiences for the viewer, for the visitor, for the person who's standing in front of the canvases too. And these are quite large works as well. They're quite monumental in this exhibition, in the show. And I think that also pulls you into the canvas as well, to see them on the scale too.
No, absolutely. Yeah, I think the scale is interesting because something else that I was thinking about in terms of when we're talking about the body and even the viewer standing in front of this work, it's not like they're monumental, but they're not overwhelmingly so. Like the representation of monumentality is a little bit different than what we normally think of as monumental, right? Like that there's this like untouchable or like kind of like larger than life presence that like maybe towers over, or is like even like built in stone, or like the kind of like different materials that monuments are typically made from. So yeah, I think there's something about scale and familiarity beyond just like the symbols or the markings that we see that we're able to kind of register or recognize, but there's a certain kind of address of the viewer as well, or an understanding that somebody's going to be standing in front of this and looking at it and taking it in, and the eye is going to move in a particular way or around the canvas, but not like you said, there are these quiet moments. There's a lot of, I wouldn't call it even negative space, but there's a spatial relationship between the forms on the canvas as well that are not, it's not like crowding or, so it's a really interesting kind of play with space and address of the viewer and the body.
And then color, which we've mentioned and touched on before, is, you know, what also strikes you as this boldness of color. But here I think he, you know, I mean, there are artists that one can think of who also have this command of color, you know, and who can speak this language of color and who can make you feel certain things through their use of color, you know. And so it's not only the references that might come up to, is it, you know, indigo blue, is it the ocean, is it the sky, is it the night sky, but really color and the emotions that color can evoke and how color really can make you feel. And I think he's, you know, I mean, I can think of several artists, landscape painters or, you know, painters in general who work with color in this really like commanding way. And I feel that that is also, you know, one of his strengths is his ability to balance all these colors, you know, and to harmonize them and to create this complete, you know, experience for us through color and the beauty of color.
There's also a really productive, I mean, listening you talk about color too and balance, I'm thinking about the productive tension between verticality and horizontality that also permeates all of the works. I'm just looking even around in this room where it's like, there are these vertical forms, these totemic forms, but then there's also, like you said, a kind of like representation of expanse, whether that's through horizontality or this kind of like elongated shape that kind of is spread across the canvas. So it's an interesting, yeah, I love thinking about that in terms of like balance, because it's, again, it's not like, it's not tension like, oh, these things are competing with each other. It's a tension that's actually very well balanced and harmonious, as you said. Yeah.
Well, I'm sure there are questions out there too, or comments, or just also impressions of the work. We have a hand in the second row over here. Jay.
This question is for you. Oh, microphone. This question is for you, Natasha. I just came from the panel discussion at Kordansky about the preeminent abstract Black artist Sam Gilliam, who was very responsible for building the next generation of Black artists and building that community. Do you know of any trend or effort or initiative that took place in the past to encourage, I don't know, artistic exchange among Black artists who are American versus Black artists who live outside of America? Anything you can share about that?
Let me just rephrase your question to make sure that I got it. You are asking if there are any exchanges between Black artists in the United States and Black artists in Africa. Yes, correct. Yes. There have been lots of exchanges between artists, and I mean, this is what is usually referred to as the Pan-African moment, you know, this post-colonial moment in Africa where many countries were becoming independent from their colonial powers like France or Britain, and during, you know, there were some big moments like that. You mentioned Faith Ringgold. You know, Faith Ringgold was an artist who traveled to West Africa, and the Pan-African movement, you know, there were these big conferences in Dakar, you know, by Leopold Senghor, the president, who was very arts and culture, progressive, forward, a philosopher, thinker himself. And that was a flashpoint in that kind of Pan-African history, you know, where the Black Panthers were looking to Africa, but also, you know, progressive, socially aware African-American artists too. So there have been various moments throughout time, and even now, you know, You have artists in the present, artists like Hendy Wiley, who have established residencies in Senegal, you know. You have, you know, this movement that is connecting younger, you know, Derek Fajour is an African-American artist who also, you know, made a trip to South Africa. And so, you know, I was in South Africa recently, and Ayanna Jackson was there, who's an African-American artist who works in photography and does performative photography with, you know, investigating historical and diasporic experiences. And so I think that there have always been these moments, and at times they were hyper visible, and, you know, and we are actually living in a moment where there is a lot of movement between Africa and America. And I mean, there always has been, actually, you know, and it's not only visual artists, it's poets, it's musicians, it's writers as well. Would any of you like to jump in on that? So,
yeah, I was just going to add that I think it's important to also think about it in terms of like tiers, I guess, maybe. Like, so what you were talking about and is a really robust archive of artist-driven exchanges based on either correspondence or just a kind of like looking to Africa. There was a lot of early 20th century Black philosophers, Alain Locke being probably the most prominent one, who was instructing and encouraging African American artists to look to the continent to kind of recover certain legacies and an ancestral past.
Collecting African art too.
Collecting, which brings me to the issue of the tier of patronage. Like there were folks like particularly white patrons like Nancy Kennard and Carl Van Vechten. Again, I'm thinking of the first half of the 20th century, but also the Harmon Foundation. And there's another foundation that I'm thinking of right now that was also funding African-American artists' travels to the continent and vice versa. But the Harmon Foundation in particular, and there was a show at the Phillips Collection recently, and I think there's a catalog worth looking at. And so the Harmon Foundation in particular was instructive to making this exchange, bringing Black artists from the continent to the US, particularly kind of within the HBCU context, historically Black colleges and universities. A lot of their artworks are also in these collections of HBCUs, which need a lot of conservation help. So if anybody wants to put that project on their annual giving list, please do, because we need those records to be preserved. We need these objects to be preserved. But those are a few. I was thinking about kind of like the artist-driven, the patronage piece, and then maybe even the state funded stuff, like through WPA. I mean, there's a whole bunch of there's a lot. So there's different tiers of it.
And I think, you know, piggybacking, I think the intellectual also exchanges, you know, books. I think you mentioned the Panthers. They were in Algeria for a bit.
And Marilyn Nance's show at Robert's Projects now is about Festac and her photography.
Also
Festac
in
77, which is the second Festac.
Yeah.
So that's also another kind of result of that. And that was like a state-funded thing. Like the governments kind of organized amongst themselves to create this thing, but also artist-driven at the same time. So there's...
And that was like music, poetry, writing. And then Kimberly Gant had a lovely show about the Mbari House. And Jacob Lawrence made several paintings when he went back to Nigeria. And what's interesting about the Mbari House, and talking about patronage, was, you know, when these houses would happen, the community would provide resources to ensure that those artists who were sequestered, that their families were taken care of. So I think using that as a model to think about, you know, patronage, community, supporting artists and whatnot.
Other questions? Great.
This is intimidating. Maybe I have some comments. I just thank you all very much for this conversation. It's been really great to kind of dip back into the rhetoric of art history and see the ways in which these paintings are decolonizing a lot of that. So I really appreciate kind of, Tiffany, your reference to, you know, the ways that like European artists were kind of appropriating African iconography, and I feel like these are inverting that, right? It's like saying, oh yeah, I can play with ABEX too, on the ground of all of the other symbolism, which is so clearly not European. And I just wanted to observe this, your invocation of the footprint and the foot, and talking about, I mean, I can't remember exactly what you said, but for me, it kind of reframed it, like not as a dismissive thing, but it got me thinking, why is it that we fetishize the hand of the artist, but we think about the foot as somehow being irreverent, you know, and here instead, it's very clear that it carries as much weight and value as the hand, because we see like the foot drawn in the upper right, and here too, like there's the reference to the soul.
Yeah.
So I thought that was like this really great aha moment. And then I hate Pollock so much, so I just wanted to say,
Same.
the Navajo, I mean, I think more of like Navajo sand paintings and the works done on the floor. So like, I think thinking about the feet, and Natasha was also talking about how like his studio is there's paintings on the floor, and I think this relationship to the floor is so important when we're talking about the history of abstract expressionism, but also the colonial kind of dominance over that. So like reclaiming the ground. Anyway, thank you.
Yeah, no, those are great
that.
observations.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for sharing.
Love
The
that.
foot. Yeah. I don't know if y'all have thoughts.
Yeah, it's
Or
like
if we need to respond to anything, but that was great. I love that. And it's also the imprint. Like I think, like with the artist hand, it's like, you know, that's a really complex thing. But I also think that we typically think of like, oh, our hands are able to take care of things, like because of the sensitivity and the dexterity of our hands versus our feet. But I think you're right that the way that Ouattara imprints the canvas with the footprint, or with the foot, is also very much care, right? Like we see that there's like an intentionality to it that's not just like haphazard, and it's not like trampling over, you know, like it's like you said, a kind of, yeah.
I see it as like you cited the index, and I see it
Yeah.
as being indexical of the weight of his body.
Yeah.
You know, that it's
Yeah.
his presence on this ground.
Yeah.
And the ground, you know, both literal and pictorial in the work. So
Yeah, I love that. Yeah.
What's interesting is, I don't want, as I'm looking at the paintings and where the feet marks show up, and this is me just speculating, I almost think like he's using his hand to apply
to put
the boot.
a boot. Oh, interesting.
Because if one was walking in a pedestrian ambulatory way across the canvas, you would have more footprints. So I think, you know, the pointed nature of where the footprints show up, I think he's maybe coloring the shoe and then applying it with his hand, unless he's got some serious hops that he's jumping from.
I mean, he could be moving around the canvas and like kind of like putting his body like but it's an interesting question. Like, but I think that at the very least, the issue of weight, as you said, and like registering his presence, and like the color concentration where like maybe he's pressing harder, or like there's more paint on the sole of that boot that registers in a different way than like the kind of faded footprint. I think that's really a beautiful articulation.
Yeah.
Yeah, we like that. We like that observation very much.
Yeah.
But you know, something that I think is reflected in this conversation is just that in the intentionality that we feel and sense there's great intention within the work. And I think that Ouattara would be very happy to hear this conversation, because this is really what he wants his work to, you know, be about. Is about, you know, having these conversations, unpacking these themes, and, you know, more so than what exactly is what, but to bring people together to be able to have this endless conversation about, you know, these very carefully placed intentions that that I see in the work.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's an incredibly generative practice, so yay.
In the weeds about the symbolism now, but as you're talking about intentionality, and I don't know if anyone mentioned already these progressive symbol, like this kind of crescendo of forms that happens either in the triangles or the half circles, and to me those read very much as a timeline. Like, so these look like a chronology, like a map in time in a way. But I don't know if they're. I mean, I hate to ask for like a one-to-one, but
I think to Natasha's point, and again, the kind of come back to music, the word crescendo is a perfect word here, because I don't think it's necessarily about a one-to-one relationship. I think it is about a kind of, I mean, you can think about accumulation or volume. I mean, there are all these other words that come to mind when you look at it as a progression isn't even the word either, because I hesitate to think of these as chronological or even teleological. I think that the work resists that in a way. But I think the kind of like what I mentioned earlier about a system of notation, I think that's really useful and brings it back to also like the bare bones of composition, whether it's musical scores or painting. So I'm interested in notation as a word rather than maybe chronology.
And also the studio as a place where those compositions are created, you know. And I think there's still room. I would say that even within his practice, he's still surprising himself too. There's still room for surprises, you know. And I mean, maybe the footprints are a surprise, you know, even for the artist himself, because the space of the studio is so geared towards composing, you know. I mean, it is clearly that space of composing. It made me very curious to think about what the space of his home is like with, you know, his wife and daily life, etc. Because the space of the studio is so much about making these compositions. And, you know, as we started the conversation, that it is a very strict, you know, there's a strictness to that space. You know, there's no photography, there's music in the space. You know, appointments are scheduled around where and at which point the developments of these works are, etc. So even that is very thoughtful, you know. But ultimately, I think that being able to enter the work and have all these, you know, go in some of these really interesting directions, and to have this engagement is really at the heart of the practice, you know, is to sort of there's this presentness, you know, this here-ness, this now-ness of the work that we can enter into and engage with. And I think that would make him so happy to know that people have this deep interest, you know, that there is this deep sort of connection with the work.
Yeah.
So, are there any other questions or comments or? Well, on that note then, I would like to thank Tiffany and Ike and you for being here, and to Karma for having us.
Yeah.
Thank you all.